So hello and good evening. So first, let me tell you the concept of this evening, and it fits into a larger program. This component is part of a energy medicine, particularly a medical intuition program, where I take all of the organ systems and speak to the spiritual messaging when a client comes with a symptom about what's behind it, specific thoughts, specific emotions, specific desires that are trapped in the body cellular level, energetically, at the energetic level that develops then into an illness. What I've done is I've taken just a part of the digestive module, and I've tailored it since you're studying Ayurveda to more of an Ayurvedic lens and what problem in society I'm trying to address with this particular education. So that's the objectives that I set out, is to bring it home to an Ayurvedic lens through the digestive tract, not only to bring in the physical aspect, but because Ayurveda is a mind, body, spirit medicine, so that you can have a spiritual piece as well. And something interesting happened, I think it was a few weeks ago. Your instructor and I were talking, and I'm going to be giving a talk in a couple of weeks in the health coaching class. And we were talking about how a lot of the clients coming for health coaching are actually seeking a spiritual component to their health coaching. And this is just going to grow and grow and grow, right? The interest in spirituality, the interest in addressing whether it's words like trauma or things that are triggering, or we'll talk tonight a little bit about the gut-brain axis. These are themes and words that are entering our everyday language because we're really identifying the connection, not only between mind-body medicine, but the larger spiritual aspect of it. So I hope that for your practice, for yourself, you can walk away with a little larger understanding of the spiritual journey as a whole and the function of illness within that journey. So let's start with the course objectives. What I'd like for you to walk away with this evening is, because spirituality is oftentimes metaphorical, that you understand some metaphors that we use in Ayurveda. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the digestive tract, but as a metaphor with the serpent, and how Ayurveda not only physically, obviously the importance of the Agni and gut health in Ayurveda, but how that translates to a larger objective of mental health and spiritual health overall. So we'll talk about digestion in terms of spirituality, really in terms of thoughts, the inability to digest or metabolize thoughts or trauma or experiences that the individual has encountered in life, and how that shows up somewhere in the digestive tract and can indicate being stuck or being trying to surpass something on their spiritual understanding of life and the world as it is, and why perhaps an illness occurs in a certain part of the digestive tract. This is by no means comprehensive. Like I said, it's a small section of a much larger program, but that is the ultimate goal. One of the things I'd really like to talk about tonight, and I'm going to be using the concept of the hero's journey. If any of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell, he popularized the hero's journey. It's very mainstream language these days in terms of answering a call for the larger purpose of your life. And so I'm going to use the steps of the hero's journey as those that mimic the spiritual journey and the stages of, not so much the stages of digestion, but the organs in the digestive tract. And then lastly, the organs of the digestive system and their relevance to the spiritual path. And if there is illness that occurs in any one of those, what it signifies. So I'll give you the larger spiritual significance of each of the organs. So let's start with the universal law. And there's three that I'd like to concentrate on this evening. The first universal law, and universal laws are exactly that, universal. They don't respond to earthly truths. They're more larger spiritual universal truths found in everybody, in every culture, throughout science, etc. They're universal because everybody is exposed to them, whether they know of them or not. So the first law is known as the principle of Metabolism. And you might have read this in many different ways. Last time we saw a bit of Sankhya philosophy and how those elements trickle down and not only create the thoughts and the archetypes that we talked about, but end up reflecting in the life that we live and the conflicts that we have. So the essence of the principle of Metabolism is that all is mind. All originates not only from a universal mind, but from our mind. So thoughts is a very big component of the spiritual path, and it's actually the beginning of the spiritual path. So we cannot talk about spirituality with talking about the importance of what's going on consciously, but more so subconsciously in the mind, because that's what's creating the problems. The second law is known as the principle of correspondence. You might have heard it as within, so without, as above, so below. So one of the references that we'll make is to a food bolus, and as it enters our digestive tract, as within the representation of what's going on outside in a client's life as well. And lastly is the law of vibration. The law of vibration states that everything vibrates, that nothing is still. And so our life is a constant movement. There's either movement forward or what we deem is backwards, but really it's just circular and rhythmic. And the digestive tract is no different. If you identify peristalsis and the movement of a food bolus throughout the tract, you can see that is constant in vibration and in movement. And then when there's stagnation, that's when problems are created. Any questions so far? Okay, so why is this an issue? Why is there an importance to talk about digestion and link it back to spirituality and thoughts and emotions? It's a very big issue right now. Over 40% of Americans are suffering from some form of digestion issues. I chose this picture because there's some phenomenon going on where very young people in their 20s and their 30s, are like showing on Instagram their ostomy bags. Like, if this were an epidemic, an issue, it would be in the larger, older population. And so younger and younger people are having very severe digestive problems. And I'm not here to speak to it physically, and you're learning that in your Ayurvedic program. I'm here to bring in a hypothesis about a spiritual problem that's larger, more universal, that we're undergoing. So the AGA started a Trust Your Gut campaign. Even in the language, we're starting to see this idea of trusting your gut linked to intuition. That's something that people say, I trust my gut. Intuition is directly related to the spiritual path. So the play on even the name of this campaign. The data that was released shows that nearly 40% of Americans have stopped routine, just regular routine activities. And that is indeed, in psychological jargon, when something is disrupting your daily life activities, there is something there. There's some problem that needs to be addressed. So people are stopping just routine activities in the last year due to bowel symptoms. And oftentimes there's no clear-cut diagnosis, or it can take up to a year to be diagnosed. And it's really affecting quality of life. So exercising is something that's decreased. Basic running of errands, spending time with friends and family, because if you're in pain, there's a ton of commercials. There's this one commercial where the lady's working on her computer about to give a presentation to her superiors, it appears, and she runs to the bathroom. And so this is just part of people's lives these days, and there has to be an underlying reason. Colorectal cancers under age 55, something that was typically attributed to an older population, or up 20%. So this is the sort of call to action that that I'm trying to respond to from the spiritual aspect and the spiritual philosophy. So big language these days, gut-brain axis, this idea of the gut being the second brain and communicating with the neurology. And so one of the things I really want to focus on, and we'll talk about this a little further later on tonight, is the emotional and the cognitive, which is the thoughts. The connection between the thought and the emotion, which I'll go even further, I mentioned before, our desires. This lower nature of the human being, this personality structure of each of us, is thoughts, emotions, and desires. And it's the inability to metabolize, digest, break down what is happening to us as an individual because of family issues, trauma, sexual relationships, whatever it is, shows up as the spiritual journey and is showing up more and more in most people's digestive health issues. So this two-way communication that should be, I'm thinking and feeling something or desiring something, and then the metabolizing or the digestion of that thought or that emotion, there's some disconnect within this communication system. And so part of the hypothesis I seek to answer is that digestion demonstrates indigestible experiences. We're seeing a rise in digestive issues, nervous system issues. One of the things that my clients show is a very high rise in perfection problems, boundary issues, codependence, and this is all related. And I'm sure that your instructor, who is 10 times better than me in talking about the semi-permeable membrane and the vagus nerve and all of her expertise, that's what's happening in this digestive tract. When this boundary is no longer keeping what's supposed to be in the digestive tract, and it's seeping into the blood system, and it's into the bloodstream, and it's creating a systemic problem. This is more than just food. This is more than just, a weak microbiome. This is now a larger spiritual connotation to what is happening in the majority of people that show up at my office, and I know all of the ones that show up in hers. So there's a lot of language that's permissible now around the word trauma and traumatic experiences. Mental health is obviously at the forefront. COVID sort of catapulted the permission to have these conversations. But I want to stop here and educate. The spiritual journey has always been about experiences that are painful, about traumatic experiences, about triggering experiences, because the beginning of the spiritual journey is the beginning of our incarnation. And so the moment we're conceived, or if you prefer to think of birth and even 0 to 7 childhood, those experiences must be traumatic and triggering to some level. Not everybody has the same level of pain and suffering, and that's not what I'm trying to espouse here, but there is a wounding that occurs upon incarnation. And so the spiritual path begins at that moment. And so our society now permits these words, but we have to understand this particular point so that we can understand that the spiritual path has always begun from the moment we've been given a body. And so that moment begins the painful experiences that we need to, through our spiritual experiences, digest, metabolize, integrate, and of course, accept. And we're having more and more trouble with this. I'm not 100% sure as a psychotherapist that all of the permission about talking around it is leading us to changing much. So, and maybe this is just transitory. Maybe this is just the first step, that we have safe spaces to discuss these experiences, and then action comes later. But these conversations are important, and and the point of this evening is to see how they can lead to some behavior change, to metabolizing and digesting the experiences so they can be accepted and more in alignment with how the world works. And that's part of just spirituality, is shifting an illusory worldview so that you can come into acceptance and reality of what is. Ayurveda, being a mind, body, spirit philosophy, is important to address all three. And so the focus of tonight, even though I will talk about Agni and some of the things that you've spoken from the physical health component, and I know that you've tackled mental and spiritual as well, is really to bring in more of that spirituality. And I'll talk a little bit about myth and symbol with Dhanvantari as well. Any questions? So let's go into the teachings of the path. And let's start with Ayurveda, since you guys are studying Ayurveda. So Ayurveda is the science of life. And the basic premise of Ayurveda is that gut health is health. So when there is such an increase in digestive problems, it's important to understand that in a larger context, health is not the absence of disease or the ability to just do common functioning, which we see in the literature is even being affected by these daily activities being unable to be addressed by a lot of people, but that the state of the gut, the state of your digestive tract is indeed the health comprehensively, mind, body, and spirit. So we cannot not address something that's on the rise. So as you've learned, Jataragni is the central of the 13 Agnis. It is the central digestive fire in the stomach and the duodenum. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the actual organs aligned with the spiritual path of the hero's journey. And there's 4 types of digestion. And this is the first sort of stop for a moment and understand that the digestion that either you or your client encounter has a lot to do with the way that the thoughts are being either processed or ignored or suppressed, or how the subconscious thoughts are taking over. So as you know, Samagni is more of that balanced, healthy digestive fire. So the Mandagni is a sort of slow gut. That Tikshagni is like that fast gut. Immediately after consuming food, you're running to the bathroom. And then that Vikshagni is both a combo of the slow and the fast. So what I'd like for you is to position the gut health and the exploration of the digestive system and the gut health and the bowel movements for yourself and if and when, or if you're currently seeing clients, as the same relationship that they have with their thoughts. And so a lot of this idea of Mandagni, of slow, is perhaps an inability to process thought at all, a suppression, a repression, an ignorance, a distraction. You can see a lot of distraction with Tikshagni, where people are onto one relationship after another, the next bar crawl after the other, the next physical activity craze after the other, all in an attempt to not sit and process thoughts. So there's a direct relationship with that digestive fire and how it shows up in the client in alignment with their thoughts, the way they process them, the way they think, perhaps how fast and furious they're thinking, and like I said, onto the other. And perhaps an inability to accept, so they can't sit with it, and then, and for instance, with the Vikshagni, then they kick into a fast behavior or something that's distracting, and then they slow down. Perhaps they're sad or they're grieving that lack of happiness and contentment that activity didn't give, and then they're back out there. So you can start to see, as mentioned in the law of correspondence, a reflection of what their external life is linked to their digestive tract that originates in the thought quality. So this is the first sort of idea that I want you to kind of sit with this evening in terms of how this affects the spiritual journey and perhaps the lack of digestion or metabolizing of thoughts that enter someone's consciousness. And it's unfortunate, but about 99% of our thoughts are subconscious. We think we're egoic here in a conscious mind making choice, but we're really not. And we talked a lot about choice and fire in the previous time I was speaking. We're going to talk a little bit more about that this evening, because that really is ultimately the responsibility of the spiritual path, is to learn to choose and choose the fire appropriately. Any questions? So Agni. So Agni is broken down into A, G, and Ni. And the A is to go. So we're talking about something that must be burned away, something that is not useful to us. We'll talk a little bit about victimhood momentarily. So we'll just for a moment just think of an experience that has an essence to it, something to learn, and what doesn't serve us from it must go. It must be burned away in the fire. The G is for glitter. It's to burn. We're going to talk about the essence of the food quality, the amrit, the nectar that we want to extract from an experience, both not only from a food source, but from a lived experience that perhaps created pain and suffering. There's something to extract from there that is glitter. And then Ni is to carry. We have to carry on into the world in our return back to self. And you'll see this in the return home in the hero's journey, to carry that experience into the world, to then warm another, to serve another through that experience that we ourselves went through, that hell that we walk through. So the word itself speaks of the spiritual journey. It's not just the extraction of the essence of the food source and the nutrition, but it's also representative of our spiritual journey. So oftentimes we talk about slowing down to eat and making food and prayer over our food a spiritual experience, like a contemplative practice. This is something that can be introduced into your life and to your clients' lives, which is not only that the food nourish the cellular sort of physical structure, but also the spirit, and bring light to the mind, to the thoughts that are creating any digestive or earthly conflict or earthly upset. And really think of the food that we're consuming as every meal is an opportunity to engage with our spirit and say, may this serve me, what needs to go, and may I be able to bring the learned experience of this experience of the food and the suffering into another person's lives so that I can warm them and serve them. And that really is the circle that we'll go through in the hero's journey. So in Ayurveda, we talk about food transformation, and there's the prasad, which is the essence, that nutrition that we glean from the food source, and then the chitta, which is the excrement, whatever is extracted, it's the waste. When you go to temples in India, or if you have a puja room in your home or some sort of spiritual space, what they offer you is prasad. They offer you an offering of sweets at the temples. And it is directly related not to just the rasa of sweetness and bringing sweet into your life and joy, but also to extract the essence of all experiences, that you can find a way to extract some sweetness, some sugar, some learned lesson through the experiences that are painful that we all share as a human race, and knowing what to release from those experiences that no longer serve and not to hold on to. And so in essence, not only is the spiritual practice of going to a puja ceremony or eating, but they're both really wrapped up into a spiritual cycle of walking the spiritual path, which is exactly this: metabolizing, digesting difficult experiences, getting the lesson from them, extracting and eliminating what is useless, and then serving back into the world. Any questions so far? So I'd like to share a little bit of sacred text and a little mythology, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll go into the actual spiritual journey in the organs. So we must talk of Dhanvantari, who is the figurehead of Ayurveda, and this is found in the Puranas. So it speaks about Dhanvantari emerging from the ocean of milk, and milk is a metaphor for childlike essences. It's a metaphor for a person who is not standing on their own 2 feet, who has not yet individuated to life. And what it's wrapped up in is a bit of victimhood, right? If we're still expecting our parents or the world to treat us as such, if we feel that we're special, or if we feel that we're unable to really accept the world as it is, that when we talk of milk in mythology, we're talking about someone who's young, who has like perhaps a developmental, mentally, I'm not talking about developmental disabilities. I'm talking about we might be stuck in a stage or a trauma from the younger times. And so it feeds into this concept of taking what serves us and leaving the rest, and also maturity on the spiritual path, which is ultimately what we're seeking. And so he emerges from this ocean and he's holding the Amrit. And it's from those childhood experiences or victim experiences or painful experiences that we extract the essence. The Amrit is the nectar of the gods. So you might have learned of ojas, like those drops that are in your heart. It's that idea that that is the gold that's within us, but it takes some churning, like the GI tract, to get there. It's not, oh, one and done, I understood the lesson and I don't have to struggle and perhaps go through some churning through life to really understand what this experience taught me. Shiva's serpent, and we will talk about the metaphor of the serpent. Vasuki helped churn the ocean. The serpent, and we'll see that in a moment, has to do with tricksters, and the thoughts are the tricksters. All along the digestive tract, we find sphincters and we find areas to sort of continue pushing the bolus through. At every threshold, at every sphincter, that is an opportunity for us to stop, either metabolize and digest the experience and continue, or to back out and say, this is too painful, I'm just going to kind of observe life rather than living life. And so our thoughts become the tricksters, the serpent that churn with us and our victimhood for either us to get out of our own way or become detrimental. And this goes back to that law of mentalism. It really is all about the mind and that strength of mind so that we can continue down painful experiences. So Amrit is our essence, and the goal is to expand consciousness from the thoughts. And that really is what leads to acceptance and the change that we're seeking on a spiritual path, which is more contentment, more wholeness, more balance. So going back to the original dosha balance from birth, for instance. So Agni is the fire deity and represents all transformative energy and knowledge in the Upanishads. So we talk about the spiritual journey in alignment with the Agni of our digestive tract. There isn't a part, that's why there's 13. There isn't a part of digestion does not require fire. And the metaphor for fire is choice, is free will, is creation, is passion, is purpose. And if we don't have that will to push us through these difficult experiences, then we kind of get stuck and there's stagnation. And so it's not only stagnation with food in our body and perhaps constipation or gas, but it's also what's created in the thoughts, and then ultimately what our life becomes. That stagnation, our life becomes, because we can't get out of that victimhood and that child-like thinking that we should expect a savior or a rescuer or someone to treat us well, when really this is an internal job, as the digestive tract very clearly indicates. And Agni is also what we call the central witness of the rites of passage. You're going to see in the hero's journey, every step along the way, there's mentors, there's teachers. This is not a journey we can take alone. So whether it's you as an Ayurvedic practitioner, or me as a psychotherapist and a metaphysician, or if you go to analysis, or you just talk to your friend about your lived experiences, or you're in a group setting, there needs to be some witness. And it's the fire god Agni that each stage of transformation, each stage of digestion and metabolism, hopefully all the way to transmutation and excretion, that is there as a witness internally, reminding us to keep going, shining the light, holding the torch. And so this metaphor of how much fire and how much Agni is needed in digestion is really important. And it also relates to the thoughts. If our thoughts as an air element are not evolved, are not expanded upon with the fire element, we do not expand in consciousness. We stay in our same limited thinking. So fire is symbolic of not only extracting the prasad, or the essence of food, but also the wisdom of the thoughts that are entering our consciousness. So even though this is Greek, I think it's relative, especially because when you studied energy medicine and the chakras, you're going to see, or you've seen already, the chakra system that are two serpents intertwined. We talk about Kundalini at the base of the spine, and then raising consciousness through the Kundalini and the Ida and the Pingala. So in Greek medicine, or Greek mythology, we talk about Asclepius, and he's the god of medicine, and he has this rod, Asclepius's rod. And it's said that he was kind to a serpent, and the serpent gave him what is known as secret knowledge. So we cannot talk about the serpent that is our digestive tract without also talking about the serpents that are our chakra system, that is our energy body, right? In Ayurveda, we're talking about spiritual, energetic, mental, physical, it's all included. And so when you see such an obvious symbology of as within, whether you can see energy or not, you can palpate it, you can ask the questions to see where the client is stuck in their energy body, in their chakras. You also can see that throughout the digestive tract. So these two have a real correlation. And so the secret knowledge is the hermetic wisdom. It is the wisdom of the body. And it's unfortunate, but one of the ways that we are initiated into a spiritual journey, one of the very common ways, is through illness. The wisdom of the body is such that it knows that when you're sick, you will be forced to put yourself first. You will be forced to create a boundary with those that are perhaps taking your energy, that membrane that has now become so permeable, and learn to say no, or learn to go to the restaurant and ask for gluten-free, or say, I can't eat there, I must eat at this space, or spend your money and your resources on something higher quality. So the wisdom of illness has always been one of many reasons, but always been a link back to an initiation of a spiritual journey. I'd say that I'm a shaman, and many people that are called to the shamanic path are indeed suffering from some physical problem. Carl Jung was very good friends with a physicist named Claude Poncelet, and they talked about this. They talked about how all illness is spiritual, all illness is energetic. And so we cannot ignore the importance of when we're talking about our chakra system and the Ida and the Pingala and the balance of our right and our left and our masculine and our feminine, and how that serpent mirrors the physical body, that these two are directly related in some way. And so Asclepius was the bearer of a rod, and it became Asclepius's rod of healing, and it is symbolic of medicine, but it really is energy medicine. So spiritual medicine, energetic medicine, physical medicine, they're all one in the same. When you studied Sankhya philosophy, you started with the Akash, then you went into the air, then you went into fire, and then you went to water, and then you went to earth, just like the creation down of our chakras. It's the same thing. The illness starts in the ether upon conception into the air of the thoughts, and all the way down until we're given our body. And so when there's manifestation of the illness, and I don't know if you guys covered Samprapti, the stages of Samprapti, once it's in the tissues, once it's overflown in the tissue, overgrown into the tissues, and there is what Western medicine would call a diagnosis, now it's in the more dense elements that we call the body. But this illness in Ayurveda started way beyond that, when it was already disrupting within the dosha, just the energy and the cellular, sort of the energy aspect of the body before it transitioned into the physical. So that illness creation is the same as the universal creation in the Sankhya philosophy, down to the elements and our senses and so forth. So these are always interrelated. Any questions? No? Okay, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll go into digestion until the end of the evening. Let's just pause the recording. Okay, so now I want to get into the metaphor of the digestive system as a spiritual path, and we'll finish out with that, and then we'll answer questions. So I like to call this spiritual biochemistry. When we eat, right, when we get the food and we extract the macronutrients and the micronutrients, it goes all the way down to the cellular level. This is the exact same thing with our spiritual path. And the nutrition is the thoughts. At the end of the day, the nutrition is the thoughts. The thoughts are wrapped in an emotional response that keeps us in victimhood. And what is a struggle, if you will, is a desire that we have, a desire perhaps for something to be different than what it is and not accepting our reality, perhaps a desire that we have to understand a shadow aspect about ourselves. And so this idea of a thought, emotion, and desire starts at that thought level, but goes down to the cellular structure. And this becomes our biology. So our spiritual biochemistry is really linked to what we're consuming. It just may be through the senses rather than just the mouth. The digestive serpent, the digestive tract mirrors the hero's journey, and we'll see that. And the illnesses that are appearing in your digestive system mirror the issues you have in your psyche, your undigestible material, your unconscious shadow aspects that perhaps haven't been fully integrated. And so all of that material, if you think of it like the foodstuffs, gets stuck. And that's the stuff we're trying to integrate in order for us to individuate from that ocean of milk that we can individuate and extract the essence and the amrit of our lived experience so that we can indeed serve another. As I said before, this is a tiny, tiny piece of a much larger program. In the medical intuition and energy healing program, I talk about the layers and layers of each of the organs, the mucosa, the cells. There's a lot of detail in the spiritual journey of why that person appears with a problem in that organ or on that particular part of the tract. So this is the larger umbrella of that. And then, of course, you can go more into the more specificity of what the person is struggling with in their thought structure, emotions, and desires. So it's a good starting point to start connecting the mind, body, and the spirit. And so here, as we see with the chakras and we see the Ida and the Pingala, it's the serpent. We also can identify that the digestive tract as well is serpent-like. So the gut tells the untellable story. I mentioned before that there are safer spaces. Our world is becoming a bit safer to talk about trauma, to talk about triggers, to talk about mental health issues. But really, it's not yet, I think, the larger comprehension that it's a shared human experience. There's still some even competition with suffering and pain. And so if we really understand that the beginning of a spiritual journey begins at incarnation, where we chose, and we saw that the last time I was here, to jump into this incarnation, and we made a choice at that moment to burn this karma and to have this version of pain and suffering, that allows us to center ourselves not as victims, but as students of life, as these experiences are here to extract something and extract an essence. And it doesn't mean that it's any less painful. And again, in the earthly world, different experiences are different experiences, right? So that's not what I'm getting at. I'm getting at the spiritual nature of pain and suffering. And so our gut, to this day, and hence the increase in these GI issues, tells the untellable story. If you've been with somebody that you're very close to, a romantic partner or a child or a friend, and they pass gas, or they belch, like, that's usually something reserved for a close relationship. Or if someone in a yoga class passes gas, we even see that on TV now. You know, they're making kind of fun about that, about the gases, natural gases that we have in our body. It's something more acceptable to talk about. But still, we live by social convention. These aren't things we talk about. The other day, I was listening to the Charmin commercial, and you know, they're like those bears, those talking bears, and it was on the radio, and what it appeared to be like the woman bear of the couple said, "We're not supposed to talk about our bathroom habits, so let's sing about it." Like, we're getting more comfortable, and we're getting much more comfortable in mental health circles to talk about the triggers and the pain and our fight or flight responses. But it still hasn't jumped into ownership. It still hasn't jumped into this is an aspect of self that needs to be integrated into me, that I am not a victim. And that really is the goal of that, of the spiritual experience. Again, notwithstanding the painful physical stuff, but the larger goal of the spiritual. So the gut tells that untellable story. Why is it untellable? Maybe because socially you're not allowed to. Maybe it's sexual in nature and it's shameful. But a lot of times it's untellable because it's subconscious. And you're not even aware of what is going on that is untellable. You don't know what that subconscious, what we call subconscious or unconscious psychic material is that's brewing, and it's starting to come up in digestive issues. So I have here stay, leave, return. And the spiritual journey or the hero's journey or is very cyclical in nature. I'll use the term enlightenment. Many of you might have heard the adage that says, chop wood, carry water, get enlightened, chop wood, carry water. What that adage means, similar to stay, leave, return, similar to introducing a food bolus and excreting it, or the Agni extracting the prasad, the essence, leaving the waste, and then going back into the world and serving, is this cyclical nature, is that we must jump into an experience, not know what it's going to bring, really think perhaps that it's going to go a completely different way, and then come back to ourselves. And that really is the process of enlightenment. And we chop wood, we carry water, we go through an enlightenment process that's all internal. I mean, you could be living your life and going through this severe sort of cycle of transmutation internally, and then continue your earthly life carrying wood and chopping wood and carrying water just the same after. And so this is very cyclical in nature, and each person is on a different part of this cycle. And so the goal of regardless of how you call it, has to do with becoming a self with a capital S. The self with a lowercase s is most of us. Most of us are fragmented selves. We're incongruent. We're saying one thing, we do another. We don't keep our word. We don't have integrity. We don't follow through. We don't have discernment. We really don't know what we're choosing. Our unconscious is leading most of our choices. That's most of the population. That is an S, or self with a lowercase s, because it is ego driven. So going back to that untellable story, right? I'm not allowed to say that. That's not permitted. Socially, you don't do that. You're not allowed to do this in this family or in this job or in this culture, in this religion, whatever you subscribe to. So when the ego is calling the shots, which is at the beginning of this journey, it's a very different experience than when we have a self with a capital S. That is now a soul-centered life. That is now a purpose-driven life, and the ego is along for the ride. And the trickster here is that serpent, is that idea of what will I refuse to digest and metabolize in myself so that I can come out of this and be of service through what I've learned. And so this is the goal. In depth psychology, we call this individuation, where we take complete and utter ownership for all of our lived experiences. We may not understand why. And yes, in the external earthly world, there may be someone who has done something to you, and hence your trauma and why you're triggered and why childhood was painful. And no one's removing that. But the spiritual journey as the food, which is done very much in private, has to do with the ownership of what I've put in my mouth, what I have swallowed, you know, and that starts, like I said before, from that moment of incarnation. And so the goal here is to become soul-centered with the ego following, not ego-centered with the spirit following. And so this starts off with what I call a fateful voyage. You think it's going to be one way, and it turns out to be another. And this is where the essence of desire comes in. When I work with clients, I can backtrack to where they haven't been able to forgive themselves, where they made a wrong turn, or they think they made a wrong turn, where they perhaps chose incorrectly for what they wanted for their life, and now they're seeing the results of that. And it's a fateful voyage because inevitably that's what a spiritual path is. It appears to be that you're off a path. It appears to be that you don't have a map. It appears that you made a wrong turn, and none of that is true. The essence of the spiritual path is that there is no road, that there is no map, that it is a wild, savage forest that only you can navigate. And it's done in private with helpers and mentors along the way. And you'll see that similar represented in the hero's journey. It starts off with a longing. This idea of having a desire to experience something greater, something different. the metaphors of sailors, the metaphors of crossing the ocean. We see this in myths like Odysseus. There's a longing within us because we know deep, deep, deep in our soul that our lived experiences as children or what our parents taught us is not enough, that there is something else out there for us. And it's a capital S, it's a self with a capital S. It's an individuated self. But the misnomer, the misunderstanding is that this is done externally in the world, that we are going to change the world. And it's actually that the world changes us. And what expands is our consciousness to be more in alignment with the way the world is. And that is done internally. And there's suffering and disillusionment and pain with that. So that's why we get stuck along the path and along our GI system, where there's just something we just cannot. We need more acid to break it down. We can't digest it. It develops gas because the thoughts around it can't handle it. So you'll see that throughout the digestive serpent metaphor. The serpent swallows you. Literally, you swallow the food and are in it. This serpent swallows you. The trickster swallows you. You think you're going out into some experience, and it is not the way that you had it all planned. I was watching earlier with my daughter that Evan Almighty movie, and Morgan Freeman as God tells him to build an ark. And he's like, I just got voted congressman. I have plans. And of course, the God character laughs. And it's like, your plans, God laughs, that kind of thing. We go out with these expectations, with these visions, with these ideals. And every single one of us from the moment of incarnation or anywhere on our path, find out that some delusion or illusion swallowed us. And how do we metabolize that experience and get some essence and some gold from it? That really is the larger question of spirituality. And it becomes our purpose in life, and then it becomes our service or our vocation in life. I wrote here, if you return. And there is an if. There are people that go on a spiritual journey that don't come back. They're addicted to the abyss. They're addicted to the pain and suffering. They're addicted to the work. They hide out, they escape, they never make it back to the return to give the world what they've learned, to give that Amrit, to give that essence back, that Agni. And it's sad, but this is indeed one of the pitfalls of embarking on a spiritual path. And so you might hear somebody that has GI issues for 20, 30 years, and it could be that. And then choice is the only true voyage. And along the digestive tract, we see these metabolism processes and these, peristalsis processes of movement, hopefully. And that all it is that we're doing. We're going from a limited purview, a limited worldview into a larger expansion of consciousness, and perhaps a little larger, and perhaps a little larger. That really is the essence of the entire existence. It's not that we're free of desires. It's not that we're free of being human. It's not free of judgment or manipulation or passive aggressiveness. None of that is promised. What we're promised, if we do this, if we really take this voyage, individuate, become more soul centered, is that we have a little expansion of consciousness, and that we can take choice and ownership for what we've chosen. So where are you stuck? Either you, your client, your family member. We're stuck on several parts along the road, and we'll talk about those. So when you eat food, and it turns into a food bolus with the saliva, mastication, and whatnot. So I like to call it a bolus called TED. On a spiritual journey, you're eating TED. Your thoughts, your emotions, and your desires. And that is ultimately what needs refinement, what needs extraction. Of those thoughts, of those emotions, of those desires, what have you learned? What's the learned experience? What can you take from that wounding, from those triggering responses, from those emotions that you're feeling and checking in somatically with your body and where you hold your trauma and release it and so forth. And then of course, giving back, that takes the TED bolus and makes it a soul-centered life. Or you can stay in victim. You can stay in that ocean of milk, being churned by the trickster, saying you're the victim, staying in childlike thinking, waiting for someone to save and rescue you. And then that bolus gets stuck, and it's just stuck, and it's stagnation, and it's stagnation, and it's inflammation, and it's imbalance, and all of the things that we know to be along the digestive tract. So what gets stuck? Crappy thoughts, emotions, and desires. They get stuck in a story. We get stuck in our narrative. We get stuck in our wounding. We get stuck in what happened to me. And again, in the earthly realm, stuff happened. It sucked. This is not about that. This is about the ownership, whether you understand why or why not something enters your life as a lived experience, that there is some prasad, some essence to extract from that lived experience, but only when you get out of the story, only when you remove the duality that you're separate from this larger universal mind in the principle of mentalism. And you can actually understand the law of correspondence, that what's happening outside is also happening inside. And it's simply a projection and a reflection of what needs to sort of be metabolized inward. And so our thoughts, emotions, and desires, why is this a bolus? Why does this get stuck? Well, the first reason is that thoughts are limiting. All thoughts are limiting. And 99% of our thoughts, if we actually sat and had a proper processing time, we'd realize lead us to worthlessness. That is the bottom line of human nature, is that the majority of our thoughts lead us to figure out that what we think of ourselves is that we're worthless. So why do we want to think that? Of course we don't, right? So we get distracted, maybe that tikshagni, and or we're hopeless and melancholic because we don't want to even think about the thoughts, and we're blaming society and others in childhood about what our lived experience was. So that's the first issue, is that our thoughts are usually going to lead us down a rabbit hole of worthlessness. Next is emotions. I mentioned that ocean of milk that Dhanvantari is churning with Shiva's serpent. If you stay in the churning, think of the digestion churning and the churning and the churning and the story and saying it and over, what Carolyn Mays calls woundology, that you're stuck in that narrative, in that woundology, the emotion that is projected out of the narrative, out of the victimhood story, is to manipulate an other. It's so you do not take responsibility. So there isn't a fire, there isn't a free will, there isn't a choice or a passion or a will to push you out of it. And then desires. At the root, we are desirous creatures. We want something, whether it's lustful or envious and jealous, prideful in nature, and we struggle with this aspect of ourselves. So the metaphor of what we need to digest and metabolize is this TED. Low-level thoughts around our worthlessness, the emotions that we put onto others so that they'll take care of us, and the desirous low nature that we're all animals at a root. Once we can metabolize that, if and when we can kind of push that through our digestive serpent, and we can come back home, enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, get enlightened, chop wood, carry water. Then, with all of that metabolized and digested, acceptance of what is, find a meaning in what happened, then can we use our Agni, our fire, to serve humanity. And that is, in essence, not only the process of digestion, but indeed the hero's journey in the spiritual path. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to quickly, you're going to get this PowerPoint. I'm just going to quickly, and you can always Google the function. And the reason I'm mentioning function is at the end in the practice, I want to bring up function again. But basically, I took 12, and this is not the entire digestive tract with accessory organs and stuff. These are specifically 12 organs that I'm going to go through with the 12 steps of the journey. And what we want to understand is the function. The function of the organ is going to tell you where you are having trouble and or your client. That's going to be one of the questions in our practice section at the end. So I basically wrote down the 12 organs, and we're going to see those again and again, and the function in a very short synopsis of where they fall in the order of the spiritual path and the function that they have in the actual body. So let's talk about digestion as the hero's journey. I'm using the hero's journey, a metaphor, although it could be a spiritual journey in many different traditions. This one's just very visually accurate with circle and a return back home. So it's just easy to parallel the organs to the path so that you can see exactly what's going on in each organ. So now the food is in our mouth, now our lived experience, and now we're going like Alice in Wonderland down a rabbit hole. I really like this metaphor of down the rabbit hole, not only because literally is the food bolus going down the rabbit hole, but we have to understand something about our bolus, our thoughts, emotions, and desires. Those are never ending. You're never going to stop having a worthlessness thought. You're never going to try to not manipulate or use emotions to get your needs met. You're never going to stop being a desirous animal. It's the only way that we can create anything in the world. And this is a never-ending rabbit hole. So I think it's important to really connect to that essence of ourselves. Because if we think that it's going to stop, if we think there's an end, if we think this is static, if we think the journey home and now we're on dry land, it's done, then we're kidding ourselves. And so we have to connect with this idea that these thoughts, these emotions, these desires are human animal nature, that's low consciousness, that we want to expand consciousness around, really is never ending. It has no bottom. And the bottom becomes when we can choose, when we can add some values to our life and really live a life of soul-centered and purpose-centered functionality, right? Have a larger vocation, hence the Agni. We're out of the victim story that never ends. We get out of it, and now we give back from it. So here is the hero's journey listed with the organs and what we'll go through. We'll start with the mouth as the call to adventure. We're chewing on possible change. Perhaps we're contemplating or pre-contemplation, if you're familiar with the trans-theoretical model of behavior change. We're maybe thinking, we may not even know we have an issue that we have to contemplate. So it's kind of just swooshing around in there. We're living life normally. Maybe nothing has really happened to trigger. The salivary glands are going deeper into a possibility of change, whether it starts off as a health change or an illness comes upon, or something happens in the family structure, whatever that is, there could be something here that I want to look deeper at. The throat is the possibility of taking this journey. So on this particular map, this line is the world that is known, our ego-driven world, our conscious mind. You're all here consciously made a choice to click on the Zoom, or you paid your tuition, so your conscious mind is here. But you have no clue what your subconscious mind is doing. Your subconscious mind is below this threshold, all of this, and it's acting, and it's pushing you, and it's creating thoughts and emotions and reactions, and you don't even know that that's there. So that initial sort of chewing and the mastication and, that sort of digestion process appears to be conscious. But when we get to the esophagus, like, oh, I have to swallow this experience. Now we may be thinking there's something deeper I've got to go into. We're still focused on perhaps behavior change and not belief change, but there's like, you can think of if you've ever had a bolus of food get stuck in your esophagus, like it feels like something is stagnant and stuck and I have to get this out, right? We still have an option to purge it out or push it down. And the same with the spiritual journey. When you're at this threshold, you can still go right back up and say, oh, no, I don't want to be real. I want to stay in my delusion, in my illusion of how the things work. I'm not going to look at that. So we get choices. That's that Agni and that peristalsis along the way. We also have outs in our spiritual journey. This is not like a given. And that's the trickstery nature, the serpent nature of this process. Once we are in the threshold and we've jumped, you can see here, I mentioned that there's helpers and mentors along the way. And that's where that Agni concept of being a witness to the one thing and then the next thing and the next transformation or the next thought expansion. We need this witness along our path so that we can hopefully continue. Now we're in the stomach. So now we're in the real meat and potatoes of digestion. Like the food's in there, the experience has been lived, we're having a hissy fit, we're not accepting it, problematic. I don't want to digest this, hence a stomach, right? That adds HCl to digest the larger food into smaller digestible particles. So at the stomach level, here we're beginning individuation. We realize that from what we come, that ocean of milk, of the victimhood of the story, we need to chunk. We need to figure out how to become an individuated person, a person that gets detached from the larger story of the childhood, of the family, of the religion, of the social constructs, of all of that, and go in and go in and go in. This really is that individuation process at its starting to get refined. Then we have the liver. So the liver starts to break down the limitations of our thoughts, emotions, and desires. This is really an area where a lot of people say, I'm not doing this. There are people that come out of the journey at this. I don't want to really know what I'm thinking. I don't want to really know what I'm creating. I don't want to know these things. And so, like I said before, we've got not only pitfalls, but we've got exits all the way throughout the journey. It's not typically till we get into this pancreas area that there's no turning back. So here we're going deeper into the limitations of our thoughts. What do we really think about ourselves and others? What are we really emoting and why? How desirous an animal am I? What is my real low-level consciousness? What am I capable of? That's a hard one to ask. And people really, I get a lot. That's usually where people end up in my practice. And some people stay and other people are like, nope. Then we have the gallbladder. The gallbladder is for emulsification. So it's kind of trying to understand and integrate what has happened. Why has this happened to me? What role did I participate in, whether we understand it or not? If we go into karmic, if we go into energetic attachments, if we go into family history, if we go into ancestral patterns, it doesn't matter. There's an attempt here. This is where a lot of people start seeking many methods, a lot of methodologies to kind of put a story together. Astrology is wonderful here because you can see all the facets, all the archetypes, the ancestry, the family lineage, the karmic baggage, and you start to see an emulsification of maybe I have some responsibility. Maybe I participated in this. And you see some advancement in our thinking, in our ownership, in our creating our story, getting out of victimhood around this step of the gallbladder. So what I'm trying to walk you through is if you have clients that are stuck or have symptoms along these parts, that this is an area to really address about what's going on in their lived experience, in their triggering or traumatic things. A lot of people sometimes are subconsciously motivated and things get stuck and they have symptomology, and it's the prompting of the questions that gets them to think, oh, I never thought to put that and that together. Then the pancreas. The pancreas is the key part of the journey. So because the pancreas has to do with hormones and endocrine and exocrine function, anytime, and you're going to just see this developmentally in a minute, but anytime hormones are involved, the person is going through a death rebirth process. So what do we have? Pregnancy, menstruation, menopause, did I say pregnancy, the child and teenage years. You can track hormonal shifts to a person's physical biology. That is the person going through a death rebirth experience. So if you get clients that have elevated blood work or have hormonal problems or cystic acne, things that we would say, oh, this doesn't fit a natural developmental phase, you can assume, even if it's not pancreatic function specifically, that they're living this a bit where they're trying to die of an old narrative, of an old pattern, of an old cycle, of an old story, and rebirth themselves. This is a very, very common pitfall. But I'll tell you, this can last years. This can last for someone 7, 10 years. So just because we would assume that the food travels smoothly, we know that how many pounds of feces do we have stuck in our intestines, right? It's no different with the spiritual journey. You can be stuck in any one of these parts for years and years and years and years and never get out, because you cannot find a way to accept and integrate and birth the new you that's trying to get out. So these actual shifts in our hormones, just developmentally, are ways to get us acclimated, mind, body, spirit, to the idea that to live is to die of something old. To live is to die of something outdated. To live is to die of something that does not serve. So we have built in to our life cycle already a program hormonally and in life cycles to assist us. But when it comes to ownership of traumatic or suffering experiences, it is the hardest aspect. And no matter how many opportunities we have biologically to kind of mimic that, this one is very difficult than when the body is sort of forcing you to like an adolescence to grow. We don't do it with that same facility. And the interesting thing is that the body is the loyal servant to the psyche. So those are sort of built into our life, and there's many spiritual journeys in themselves. But when you see, like I had a hormone related cancer, I was stuck there for many, many years. You see the attempt to die and rebirth because you must die to this old way of thinking, to this false consciousness, to the delusion that you want to buy into that does not exist in reality. So that's a very marked component of a spiritual journey, oftentimes linked to a change in the hormones. And your instructor can speak to that beautifully, much more than I can. I can speak spiritually, but she can teach you the ins and outs of the body. Then the small intestine. So your small intestine is now the beginning of transformation. It is not transmutation. So behavior change and belief change are very different. You can go through this entire process and still be attached to your behavior, and the belief never changed, or change a behavior, but the belief never changed. And so if the belief of, remember, it's all worthlessness. At the end of the day, it's all stripped down to a belief, a limiting belief about self around being worthless, variations of it. right? So I'm abandoned, I'm rejected, I'm unlovable. Those are the versions of worthlessness. That does not mean that you've achieved a transformation that thought has been expanded upon yet. It's simply the transformation process of a possibility that I can think something different about myself. Then we have the large intestine. So here we're talking about the stool, the actual excrement that is going to be what we call the hell. What has been your hell? Through your wounding, through your story, through that narrative, through that pain and suffering, none of that was not worth it. None of that was useless. And so when you really can articulate what that wound is and what that crap is that you needed to push out and refine and expand consciousness around, now you have your purpose. If you are not entering your wound every day, the wound is not your vocation and you do not have a purpose-filled life. That is the key. That is the importance of excreting the waste and saying nothing is wasted. I can get rid of as waste the narrative, the victimhood, the story, the woundology, the emotional manipulation, waiting for someone else to tell me that I'm a victim and meet my needs. But if you really extract what the pain and suffering, the karmic lesson, the energetic medicine is, it becomes the part of the journey where the ego succumbs to the soul. But it's just transformation. We're not at transmutation yet, but that's your opportunity. That's the promise. And how many people, raise your hand, know someone with some large intestine issue? I mean, that's what's there. They're trying. They're trying. They might have already passed an abyss. They might already said, okay, I know this has to die in me so that something new can be rebirthed. But that does not mean that they're willing to make the switch from an ego-centered to a soul-centered, and not necessarily willing to enter that wound every day and serve through that wound. That call that started here does not necessarily mean that you do it. So you could see in each step of the way, we've got outs, we've got outs, we've got outs. Even when people go through an abyss, I work with a lot of people because I bring them into that abyss through my work. They could be working with me a year, 2 years. They integrated certain aspects of the narrative that they got a bit out of the victimhood, but it does not guarantee anything. So you could start to see that this is a very long haul. And when your stool's getting compacted and impacted and your large intestine is having issues, you can start to see why, according to what's going on upstairs. Then the rectum. So now here, I wanted to mention this. This is on another slide, but I'll mention this. So this is also the stage of atonement. And I heard once, and I really liked it, that it's actually, not that it's not atonement, but it's at-one-ment. And this idea of the principle of mentalism, that all is mind, that we're all one, that we're all interdependent and interconnected. Your hell, what you consider to be the shit that you're ashamed of, the crap of your thoughts, when you can serve through that wound, your hell, your personal hell, is the salve for someone else's shit, for someone else's healing. That's a powerful space. And that's at-one-ment, because now the wound becomes the vocation. At that moment, now we're going back into what we call the ordinary world. Now the ego is repackaged. Your soul is ruling the show, but the ego is there, right? You're not like, ego death is not something sustainable. We use that term in psychology. It's just a minimization and a repackaging, if you will, so that the soul can lead the show, but the ego has to come back and join it. And the question to ask is, what identity will I assume now? What will I do with this lived experience, with this essence? What will I become? Will I walk the walk? Will I show up as a person of integrity? Will I serve through my difficulty? Or do I just return back to an ego-centered life? And again, we're one step back and we still have an out. We have outs all along the way. And then the anus is, I wrote, what will you stand for? Think of it when you're sitting. When you are well placed in your chair, people that have like anal fissures or hemorrhoids, they have severe identity problems. They don't know what they sit for, stand for. They don't know where their place in the world is. When you're back and that anus is the organ of the return back home after that enlightenment, going back to chopping wood and carrying water, you know your place. You know what you stand for. You know where you sit at the table. You know what is yours and what is not yours. Hence that boundary, that membrane that was allowing food particles to get in and cause inflammation to the system. Now there's a boundary. This is my fight. That is not my fight. This is my boundary. That is not mine. I feel this because it's mine to feel, but I don't jump in to save you because I had to save myself. That is the ultimate essence of the power, and that's the Agni. That's really the return home of the journey. So in essence, we do a reorganization of our entire being, from the wound, from the child, from our victimhood, from our crappy thoughts, emotions, and desires. We process, we break it down, disintegrate into parts. Think of macronutrients, right? The carbs, the protein, and the fat, and all the micronutrients in the water, and we repackage ourselves. But what we do is we repackage ourselves as a soul-centered individual. Our essence is what's calling the shots. We are the nectar. This is grace. We live our new vibration. We're transmuted. We don't have to say a word because people can palpate what we stand for, where we live our values, where we walk our walk. This is true transmutation of consciousness. So that limited belief about ourselves of worthlessness never goes away. Remember, that down the rabbit hole never goes away. What expands is our belief about ourselves. We now see ourselves and hence the world as it really is. Yes, we're animals. Yes, we're desirous. Yes, we have low consciousness, but I have something to offer humanity. And hopefully what we eliminate and leave behind is a bit of our crap and beating ourselves up about failures, because we're human and we're entitled to make mistakes and not have all the answers and try things out and fall. There's this Kabbalistic quote that says you fall 6 times and you get up 7. So it's that idea that even though the ego's still there, and sometimes we honor the ego over the soul, and we make mistakes and we do bad choices, that we own them. So every step of the way, there is Agni, and we have opportunities to exit. So we can never individuate, never have a self with a capital S and stay ego-led, or we can burn what we are not and really own ourself with a capital S, be more soul-centered and purpose-focused, and then at the end give back through service. Our hell, your hell is the same. I see you, you see me, right? Namaste. I see the light in you, you see the light in me, but I also see your hell because it's my same personal hell. So I'm going to skip to the practice section. Any questions? Okay, I attempted to be shorter. I'm not very good at that. So I skipped over a section. You're going to have those slides in the PowerPoint so that you can, it's a lot of what I said, but reiterated with a lot more detail about each organ and step of the journey, but you'll have the slides. So how do we bring this into practical application with a client or with yourself? We want to ask a question, okay? And we want the client to ask a question about themselves. The question in the digestive path where we're stuck, if you will, is what essence must I excrete from this crap? What is the lesson to be learned? Why would I have created this level of conflict or pain and suffering? and identifying what that is and having that dialogue, right? It gets the client recentered out of victim, in ownership. In Ayurveda, obviously the belief in karma, the belief in past lives, the belief in something having a function, right? We didn't create this energetically, and then physically, if there's a physical symptoms, without a reason. So it really recenters the client into ownership and free will, and knowing that if they created something and they can take ownership for their crap, they can also take ownership for their successes. That's something that's difficult in a perfection bound, digestive failure oriented society, right? If it's perfection, then we can't take credit for failures, but we don't take credit for our successes either. So that starts to shift and reorient the client. The other thing is asking the symptom what question it wants to answer. That symptom is there for a reason. If you have belching, right? If you have foul odor, what would that do? Would that repel someone, right? If you belch and you have this foul odor and you're like, oh, no one would want to come close to me. And that client can say, oh, but why wouldn't I want someone to come close to me? There has to be something where some closeness was dangerous prior. If I need space in my large intestine created by vata, by the gas, where in my life do I need space? Where do I need some distance? The symptom speaks to a function. The symptom speaks to a function of something in the thoughts that the client needs, and that's why the body is responding. And it also tells you the function of the organ, and you'll see that when I wrote the little, cheat sheet of the organ functions, what the organ's function is. So if we're talking about the gallbladder and we're talking about, excreting bile so that something can become more emulsified, maybe you need some emulsification in your life. Maybe your relationship is like oil and vinegar, and you're attempting, let's say, to have a child or to bring something in that can emulsify that, and that can show up in a gallbladder a problem or symptom. Yes, and there's always a root cause. Exactly, Emmeline. So that's a big part of, and I do recommend something. I'm a little bit of a know-it-all, right? So I want to know everything, and I want to tell the client everything. And, and Jen can attest to that, right? But in my own, giving myself my own space, right, to wait a response, ask the client. Ask the client what function, even if they don't know anatomy, it doesn't matter. What do you know about that organ? What do you know to be true? Have them Google it while they're at your office and read it and go give you a sentence or two synopsis. See and listen to what words of a Google search or what they've understood. Maybe they had a grandmother had a gallbladder removed and they're thinking, oh, it used to be what, 40 female and fat, right? It was like the 3 F's when you got your gallbladder removed back in the day when I was studying dietetics. That was like the acronym. So maybe that's what the person remembers. And they're reaching their 40th birthday. Like, there's a significance in what they're saying and what they're thinking and what they extract from the words they choose to say, and or even a Google search that has significance to why that's being created. So instead of jumping in and like me jump in after, because you're going to be a know-it-all too, but give them the opportunity to tell you so that you can hear what they're really thinking about. I had a client the other day who I've been working with for several months, and finally, because I could see that she has no life of her own and her kids are old enough for her to have some integration of a woman experience of her own life. Her kids are at school all day, and she said that she was taught that her grandmother said life ends at 25 because her grandmother had children at 25. So what that client was indicating was that motherhood killed you. That's it. Once you were a mother, your womanhood died. That would be a pancreas issue. That would be the abyss. That would come through as a hormone problem. And so if you hear what they have to say in response to what the function of the symptom is or the organ, you're going to get a lot of content as to where they are in their crappy thoughts. And usually an emotional response starts to bubble and you can see it somewhere. And that also gives you an idea. If you're working with chakras, perhaps with chakra, if you ask them or you see them clench their heart or they grab their belly, you can, or some people grab their throat, you can start to put the pieces of the energy, physical body together as to what's going on in the larger context of their mind. And what's the gut saying? So this goes back to the beginning. If they have a tikshagni or mandagni, what are they slow to incorporate? What are they slow to process? Do they think that life, this is also linked to the thyroid, even though we're not talking about thyroid, but the gut can represent, if they have to have such an overactive gut, what are you late for? What are you in such a hurry to get to? We're very Western culture, greed of completion, right? Like we have to finish, and age says we should have this credentials. No, but that's part of the belief system. So if they say, oh, I'm late for, I should be a mother now, I'm 35. Well, where'd you learn that? And you could start to see where the digestive pattern of slowness, or if they're trying to slow something down because maybe they didn't have much of a childhood, maybe their innocence was robbed and now they're trying to slow life down because they had to grow up too quickly. You could start to make these relationships to the pace of life and why something is so difficult to get through. Maybe they have teenagers and they're about to go to college and they don't want to have empty nests because they have a relationship with their spouse. The gut will indicate if they're in a hurry, if they want to slow something down, and you can ask in the larger context of their life what they're trying to slow down or speed up. Then are they making choices? Again, it goes back to ownership. According to their value system, are they really sitting on their throne? Is their anus really well placed to do and what they're saying they're going to do? There was a quote I read once that, is your ass seated where your mouth says it should be, or something like what you're saying, is it what you're doing, you know, seated in where you are? Are they rushing? Are they in a hurry to slow down, to speed up? And perhaps they're, you know, we're talking about the digestive fire, right? That Jataragni and the Agnis that are found throughout. Where is their fire weak? Where are they afraid to be creative, to make mistakes, to make an impulse, to create something? Fire has wrapped up in all of those actions. And I'll tell you that most people have two big common ones. The fear of making a mistake is very much linked to why the Agni is so weak. It's the perfection. It's a very common thread. And the other thing is that once they put themselves out there, the judgment, the ridicule, right? Once you create something, it takes on a life of its own. You don't know where that's going to go. And people are very afraid of it. It's really rooted in control issues, which is also perfection in another sort of guise. So those are two of the biggies when the Agni or you start to see the metabolic fire really declined, and fire throughout the system. So again, asking the function and what the function of that organ is. And if it's, for instance, and you'll see that in the functions that I listed in the slides with each of the organs, if the stomach is a problem, perhaps they have overproduction of HCl, right? They have overproduction. And I know Jen is saying usually it's underproduction and misdiagnosed, because I know what she thinks. You can ask that. What can't you break down? Or what do you need help breaking down? What experience, or what experience do you not want to break down because you're stuck there because it was just such a beautiful moment and you've never been able to recreate it? Use the language of the organ and the function of the organ to put it back onto the client so they can start to make connections. And when in doubt, what crap in your life, and use the word crap, use the word shit. What crap in your life can you still not accept, can't let go of, can't metabolize, can't digest, yet just can't get it out of your head, out of your heart, out of your system? That's going to take you straight to a root of what's going on with a client. And lastly, is acceptance. The goal of all of this, no matter where we're stuck in our digestive tract, our spiritual path, our life, it does not matter. Acceptance is a getting closer. And I use that word here. Ideally, it's smack in the middle. That's usually not the way it is. So if we go back to the concept of thoughts are around worthlessness, right? At the end of the day, we all have a fear of being found out, that we feel worthless, that we feel abandonable, rejectionable, unlovable, right? We're flawed in some sense, and someone's going to figure this out. What we're trying to do is we're trying to take what we want the world to be, our lived experience to be, our life to be, our relationship to be, our bank account to be, to what it is. And if nothing else, even if it is like literally on a sliding scale of 1 to 2, bringing the client closer to what a reality is, already there's going to be improvement in the digestive tract. Right here, you're expanding the mind to get closer to acceptance. It doesn't mean that they're going to accept all of it. It doesn't mean that their entire worldview is going to align perfectly with reality, right? Delusion and denial, that's the first stage of grief. That's the first stage of where most people end up in a practice. But if we could just slide them over just a little bit to a closer worldview of what reality is, of the reality of their situation, that comes through ownership of their choices, then we can see a marked improvement, even if it's just in bowel movements or in feeling better and sleep patterns. Some shift will exist when we start moving them a little bit closer into the acceptance of their lived experience and their reality. Any questions? No questions? Okay. And thank you. And I will send the recording and the slides to your instructor, and she can send those to you. And if something comes up, you can feel free to ask me after the fact. Thank you.
No questions at all? Okay. Francis, thank you.
Slides, you're going to see a chunk of the slides that are a little bit more detailed about each of the path and each of the organs. It was just trying it for the sake of time. So thank you guys. Oh, do I log off? Are you going to continue or are you done? Because I know that this is
Give me